The Communion of Saints is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Hello and welcome to Communion of Saints. I'm Father Jim Corda.
And I'm Father Jack Lavelle.
The saint we're going to talk about today is Jerome Emiliani. You know, it's interesting because we would consider him, if we had to use one word to describe him, a humanitarian. And yet we would wonder when we would go through his life, why would he ever be a humanitarian? Let's kind of set the stage to talk about Jerome Emiliani by telling the folks that are with us around the time he was born and lived.
Well, he was born in the late 15th century, I believe around 1481. He was about 56 years old when he died. So the end of one century into the early part of the next century. One of the stories that's interesting about him is that at one point he finds himself, for whatever reason, chained in prison. We're told that, not that any prison is wonderful, but they make a very clear point of describing the prison that he was in: dark, dirty, dingy, and this dungeon is in Venice. But during that time, he enters into a time of reflection, a time of prayer, and it really affected his life that he had a turn of heart, and he really started to focus his life on God. And from that point, that's where that sense of humanitarianism comes in. You know, if you're going to have a relationship with the Lord, now we know that there are some saints in the history of the church, you know, that relationship may have appeared to be just a very personal one. You think of hermits or people that really were more in solitude. But even there, that intimate relationship with God is always drawing others in through prayer, through concern, through intercessions. But he really becomes one who understands that this newfound or strengthened relationship with God is one that has to be exhibited in how he recognizes God's other children as his brothers and sisters, and the responsibility that he bears in looking after and caring for and seeing the needs of one another.
Let's go back to that phrase that you had mentioned, that he had a change of heart. We recall that Greek word metanoia, to really turn around and to totally change oneself, and that whole sense of conversion. And I kind of liken it to the life of St. Paul. He was one who persecuted the church, who persecuted Christians, and yet on the road to Damascus, he has this vision of the risen Christ, and that totally changed his whole self, his whole heart toward God. And throughout the history of the ages, we see people who live a dissolute life, who decide, for whatever reason, to change what they're doing and turn their whole life to God. And I've often wondered, in the life of every creature, of every human being, that there's this spark of God within. So there's within everyone this desire to be what God has called them to be, and to really turn their heart and their soul to God, because God is the one who's created them. So there's that whole sense in the life of Jerome Emiliani, in the life of St. Paul, and so many across the ages who turned around, who changed their lives. And we see in the life of Jerome Emiliani his special dedication to the poor and to the orphans. And you use that word humanitarian, and we mentioned that in the beginning. Why do you think his life was so important towards the orphan and the poor? Obviously something happened prior to that.
Well, again, this renewed or strengthened relationship with God, that spark of God within, I like when you say that, because it is true for all of us. We have to ignite, that spark, and we play a part in that. We would think that in this strengthened relationship with God, more than likely, there was a reflection on the Scriptures and most likely, especially the Gospels. And so if we think of the people in categories that Jesus himself speaks about and challenges us to care for, and even the early church's view of who should be cared for, we see Jesus himself, the poor you will always have with you. That great sense to go out and to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, to bring shelter to the homeless. But then when we start to move through Jesus into the apostles, into the early church, who are the two categories we hear about most? Orphans and widows. Well, that really is code for anyone who cannot provide for themselves. First century, second century, even beyond. If you did not have an adult male in your household, you had no way of providing for yourself. So, when we hear orphans nowadays, we know there are many children who are orphaned. We don't have that culture of orphanages or institutions like that. But widows, orphans, it was biblical code for those less fortunate, those who cannot provide for themselves. And so reflecting on the scriptures, taking to heart the very serious command of Christ, Jerome, with that spark of God within, would have said, these are the people that God is calling me to work with. These are the most in need of the face of Christ.
We know that as a priest, he began the congregation of regular clerks. And like all religious congregations, they have a charism. They have a gift that they use to basically live their vocation. And so we know that the charism of the congregation is to care for orphans, poor, and sick. And so, his personal devotion really grew into creating this religious community whose charism was to care in particular for the poor and the orphans. It's also interesting that he has a special personal devotion to the guardian angels. And I often thought, when we think of the poor and the orphans and the widows, who looks out for them? Nobody. Mm-hmm. And yet they're guarded by God's angels. And so this special devotion in his own personal life was something that he celebrated among the people that he served. We've got about a minute left in this first segment. Any other points that we'd like to share with the folks that are with us about Jerome Emiliani?
Well, I think just to elaborate a little bit more on that particular devotion to the guardian angels, certainly we know that angels are spiritual beings created by God to serve as messengers of his invitation for mercy, peace, love. We know it was an angel that announced the coming of Christ and the invitation to Mary. But when we specifically look at those guardian angels, we do tend, for the most part, to equate it with children. We talk about children and the guardian angels. There will be images of a guardian angel maybe put up in their room, or, we even think of children themselves as little angels. And so there again, it really is inviting that particular charism he had, not just a particular devotion to guardian angels, but who do we think of them most guarding? The children, the most innocent, and those most in need of other people's assistance and help. And I think he lived his devotion well.
We're going to talk about another saint in just a moment. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
My name is Sister Mary Claudina, and I run a home for abandoned children. I want to take care of children who have no parents, because luckily I come from a very loving family. There are 8 of us. And I remember when one of my cousins got sick, and she called my mom and said, "Mom, the doctor has said that I might not have too long to live. Will you please raise my 3 children for me?" I remember we had a meeting at home, and my dad called a meeting, and my mom was explaining to all of us. And my father said, this powerful word, he said, "We already have 8. What is 3 more?" We learn to care for each other, to love each other, to fight among each other, to make up, to forgive, to just to be a family. And I think that's what I learned from home, and I wanted to share that with children who do not have that love and that opportunity just to know what a family is all about.
I am Marino.
Yo soy Marino.
Marino, an American Catholic organization of priests and brothers, has been reaching out to those in need for nearly 100 years in 26 countries throughout the world. Missioners, workers, volunteers, supporters, we are all Marino.
I'm Father Mike, and I am Marino. I am Marino.
I am Marino.
I am Marino.
I am Marino.
I am Marino.
I am Marino.
Welcome back to Communion of Saints. Now we're going to talk about the 7 founders of the Servite Order. We call these 7 holy founders the Order of Servites. Obviously in that word there's a whole sense of service, but they have a rich history. Let's share with the folks that are with us about this history.
Well, they were founded in 1233, so, the 13th century in Italy. Really how they started, they were 7 men from Florence. They decided to retire to a mountain, not retire like we think of it today, like, they're 65 or 67 and what are we going to do? But they retired to this mountain known as Monte Cenario. And what they do is they want to live a life of poverty and penance. But there is this invitation for others to then consider joining them, and the objective of their order is for the sanctification of the members. And so as one would become part of the Servites, there is the preaching of the gospel, there are devotions to the Blessed Mother. They focus richly on Mary's sorrows. We know about the 7 sorrows of the Blessed Mother in her relationship with Christ. But they really want people who are going to be part of this with them to be part of a deeper sense of prayer, reflection, and whatever is going on in their lives, especially penance, for their own sanctification, so that they can come through this world into the joys of the kingdom.
Let's kind of backtrack a little bit. When we talk about a religious community that kind of withdraws from the world, oftentimes we use that word cloister, or in an individual life of a person, a hermit. And so their lives would be pretty much a cloistered type of life, to kind of get away from it all, get away from the world, get away from all the lures of materialism, and spend, as you mentioned, their whole objective in penance, in prayer and reparation. What's interesting is that these 7 men, and there's always a significance when we use numbers in the church. Obviously, we know that the number 7 is a number of perfection. And we celebrate the 7 sacraments. You mentioned the 7 sorrows of Mary. So that number 7 is not only significant and symbolic, but it reminds us of perfection. And so the whole sense of these founders of the Servite Order going away from the world, they were trying to find perfection in the only way that they could, and that was through prayer and penance and meditation. So I think there's really kind of a homily or a lesson in there for us. And these people from this religious community has grown over the centuries and are found in many countries around the world. Let's talk about some of those countries and what their community is actually doing in the lives of those people.
Well, now some of them are affiliate associations or lay memberships, and we see in many religious orders there may be lay men and women who join as affiliates or associate members, who don't specifically become a priest or a consecrated religious, but who want to live the rule, want to live the order. There's a variety of countries there. Now, some are in South America and Central America. Some are still in Europe. What they're trying to do is still carry this sense of simplicity, this sense of prayer and penance. Now, admittedly, there would be less religious orders that are part of that sense of cloister anymore. We're more familiar with orders that are involved in teaching or in the care of priests or, in televangelization, whatever it may be, that reaching out. And yet there's still that very needed act of prayer, penance. As we've mentioned before, even hermits alone by themselves, their prayer is not just for themselves with God, it's inviting prayer in for God's world and God's creation and our brothers and sisters across the globe. So they still are very much part of praying for others and offering their prayer and their penance for others, but still finding that very simple way of life.
What's interesting, too, is they call themselves a Servite family. We know that religiously they're a group of priests and brothers, and yet they have an affiliation with lay men and women who want to share the same charism of their community. And we find that in most communities around the country and around the world nowadays, as their numbers have gotten smaller and there has been attrition within their communities, they've invited lay men and women to not necessarily join the order, but to share their charism. And so we see this charism of prayer, of penance, of withdrawing, of looking for perfection, to be shared among people who are not necessarily going to become a priest or a brother, but going to share that charism. Oftentimes when we talk about vocations, we talk about those who respond to a call to serve God as a priest or a religious sister or brother. But we fail to remember sometimes that there's also that call to share a charism of a particular community without actually becoming a member of that community. Let's briefly, in the last few minutes of this segment, talk about how important that is in the lives of vocations that are dwindling in the American church today.
Well, I think it's very important that everyone is able to discern their vocation. And I do think that, it's changing our understanding of vocation. But for many people, if you say vocation, they're going to think priest, and then they're going to think nun. And then if they're somewhat enlightened or a community actually serve their parish, they'll think about religious brothers. But this sense of affiliates or associate members or lay members, it is something new. But I think we need to continue to affirm, and I think work is being done to affirm everyone's vocation. We talk now about lifting up and affirming the vocation of marriage, married life. And so what that has done is really challenged us to also highlight and lift up those who choose to remain single, who do not choose to or feel the call to be in religious life as a brother or sister or priest, but who feel called to respond to God's invitation to serve. And so it is that increased sense of reverence and respect and dignity for everyone's vocation, and to meet people where they're at. We don't just need priests doing ministry. We don't need just brothers in the fields, or we don't need sisters just in the schools or the hospital. We need all of God's people responding, meeting them where they're at, and fulfilling their life's ambition with God.
We know that the feast for them is celebrated on February 17th, I believe. Originally in the early calendar of the church, it was on February 11th, but that was moved because of the celebration of Our Lady of Sorrows. Significantly enough, they had that devotion to Our Lady, but yet they would acquiesce to her in moving that feast. We're going to talk about two other saints of the church in just a moment. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
I spent 34 years as a teacher.
I just loved interacting with the students.
Many sisters, brothers, and religious order priests served for little pay, and now their communities lack retirement funds.
My very first class had 56 first graders.
Gifts to the Retirement Fund for Religious help provide for medications, nursing care, and more. Please give to those who have given a lifetime. Donate at your local parish.
God bless you for your help.
What have you done for your marriage today?
I gave my wife a hug this morning. I told her I love her. Instead of sitting on the couch, I helped clean up.
I cooked my husband's favorite breakfast.
I sent my husband a love email.
What have I done for my marriage today? It's a good question.
I gave her a call and say thinking of her. And the kids.
I did her hair this morning. I think it looks pretty good.
We're going to the museums as a family.
What have I done for my marriage today?
I made my wife coffee and breakfast this morning.
It's going to be her birthday next week, so I've been spending time today making arrangements to make that extra special.
Oh, we're spending the day together?
I bought her an orchid.
Hassan was able to let me sleep in by taking care of him in the morning.
I read the newspaper to my wife, and it cracked her up. She's still laughing.
What have you done for your marriage today? Small changes can make a world of difference. Get started at foryourmarriage.org, a message from the Catholic Church.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Saints Perpetua and Felicity. It's interesting because we've mentioned some of the saints in this series whose names are mentioned in the canon of the church in the first Eucharistic prayer. These two saints, Perpetua and Felicity, are two of those 7 women that find their name in the canon. Let's tell the folks around the time that they lived.
Well, they lived in the early church, as we would call it. They both are martyred in the year 203, and so they live in the mid to late 2nd century, and they die at the very beginning of the 3rd century. They were very young. They're a very interesting story, grouping these two women together, because there's not very much about them that they held in common, aside from knowing each other, until their faith in the Lord. And what I mean by that is Perpetua was a young bride. She was 22 when she was martyred, but she was married young, as most people would have been of noble birth. She would have been married off, maybe even 14, 15. But she was of wealth, of nobility, and Felicity was her slave, was her servant. And yet we hear of these different stories in the early church where a member of the household would become a Christian, and their entire household would be converted with them. Now, part of that, we hope, would be a genuine desire to come to know the Lord, but we also have to recognize that part of it was you were a slave, you were property, and so if your master or mistress is going to embrace this Christian faith, most likely everybody in the house. We think of one of the more famous stories in the early church of the woman Lydia, who was a dealer in purple goods, a woman of wealth, unique in the fact that she controlled her own wealth, and we hear that her entire household becomes Christian, and she turns her house over to become a church, to become a place of praise and worship. So these two women, Perpetua and Felicity, aside from knowing each other, have nothing in common. One is a noblewoman, one is a slave, but they both become Christian, and they become equal. Equal in death, and now equal in eternal life.
We have to let the folks know that are with us that slavery was pretty typical back in the early ages, and unfortunately has found its way throughout time. But most of the people who lived who were not of means were basically slaves. But I've often wondered when you were talking if that whole scenario might be turned around. Let's say that the faith that Perpetua died for was actually generated through the slave. And maybe it was a slave who understood or who captured the faith and shared it with her mistress. You often
that
wonder.
very well could be. When we hear slavery here in this country, of course, we think back to Civil War times, and we're very aware of the deep spirituality that many slaves held. Many of our Christian hymns are based on songs and hymns that came out of the African slaves' experience and spirituality. And there are stories of more women, like the two that we are talking about now, Perpetua and Felicity, than men, but where the mistress of the house or even the daughter of the landowner would have witnessed this spirituality and thought to themselves, how can these people be happy? How can they praise God? First of all, they would think, how do they even have a relationship with God? They're slaves, they're heathens, they're from this other continent. But then to see that even in such horrible circumstances, they have a relationship with God. They find joy, they find happiness, they cling to God. And there were moments of conversion during the Civil War, to a spirituality, not necessarily to the Catholic Church or any particular Protestant denomination. So it certainly could be that might have been that. And maybe they just brought out the best in each other, in their relationship with the Lord.
I think another thing to mention is that they were in Carthage in Africa. And so obviously at that time, the gospel had reached over to that place. And so we recall when the disciples were in the upper room and the command of Jesus to go into the whole world and spread the good news. And so this good news traveled. No doubt one of the apostles made their way to northern Africa and touched the heart of some of their ancestors, Perpetua and Felicity's. And so that faith continued down through the ages. And we see martyrdom at an early age, but as we look at the life of many of the young saints who were martyred, they were martyred at a young age, not necessarily in their middle ages or old age, but in their young life. And so there's something there that is encouraging them to stand up to this faith that was new to them, because obviously they were initially pagans. And so that martyrdom at a young age is extremely significant, and so we celebrate their life. Also, I mentioned in the beginning, in the canons of the Church. And so when we use the first Eucharistic prayer, we mention Saints Perpetua and Felicity. And so when we mention the saints, especially during the Mass, we kind of perpetuate, like her name says, for all time and eternity. And how important it is for us as Catholics to call upon the saints to intercede for us. And we do that. We've done that for 2 millennia now, and we're going on for time and eternity to pray to the saints. Just one final thought about Perpetua and Felicity before we end the show.
I think especially for some of our young viewers, as you mentioned, the martyrdom that came and many of the youth that were martyred, I think it does speak to the fervent desire of young people in whatever movement they may be involved in. They are very determined when they believe in a cause, and to continue to believe in the cause of hearing God's voice and responding to it. There are many, many wonderful causes that our young people are involved in across the board, whether it's politics or whether it's academics or whether it's social service, but to also be passionate about that voice of God, challenging us to follow Him each day.
And we'd like to close by letting the folks know that we celebrate the Feast of Perpetua and Felicity on March 7th. We'd like to thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
The Communion of Saints was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.